Did you see the fight this weekend? A knockdown, drag-out, Pier 6 Donnybrook. Doing the brawling? Republicans. Their opponent, President Obama's non-existent nominee to the Supreme Court. Republicans have unloaded on the non-existent nominee with shots ranging from too empathetic to too liberal to too activist. Remember, this person doesn't exist. So far, I think the non-existent opponent is actually getting the best of the fight. Meanwhile, into the fray enters Arlen Specter's replacement as ranking Republican on the crucial Senate Judiciary Committee. He is Alabama Senator Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III. Before he was Senator Sessions, plain old Jeff Sessions had his own nomination to be a judge on the U.S. District Court in Alabama blocked by the Judiciary Committee back in 1986. It seems that Mr. Sessions had made his bones as a U.S. attorney prosecuting African Americans for voter fraud. He, in fact, unsuccessfully tried to prosecute a former aide to Martin Luther King Jr. for voter fraud. That probably would not have been enough for the Senate to reject his nomination until an African American assistant U.S. attorney in Alabama testified that Mr. Sessions called him boy and warned him about the way he spoke to white people. A career Justice Department official also testified, saying Sessions had called the NAACP, quote, un-American and communist-inspired. Here's what not yet Senator, never going to be Judge Sessions said at the time.
These comments that you could say about a commie organization or something, I may have said something like that in a general way that probably was wrong.
That probably was wrong. Here's what then and still Senator Ted Kennedy said at the time.
Mr. Sessions is a throwback to a shameful era, which I know both black and white Americans thought was in our past. It's inconceivable to me that a person of this attitude is qualified to be a U.S. attorney, let alone a United States federal judge.
The Justice Department employee who testified against Mr. Sessions also testified that Sessions called a white civil rights lawyer a, quote, disgrace to his race for litigating voting rights cases on behalf of African American clients. A disgrace to his race. Mr. Sessions says that he was just joking. The Senate ultimately rejected Sessions' nomination to be a judge. But 23 years later, Jeff Sessions is a senator and is set to become the ranking member of that committee that rejected him. Set to become the ranking member of that committee as it makes the most critical decisions on President Obama's first choice for the Supreme Court. Joining us now is my friend Steve Bennett, who writes for Washington Monthly. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So by putting Sessions in this position, I have to ask if you think Republicans are sort of reinforcing the wildly out of touch, not of this era image.
Absolutely. You know, you'd like to think that this is behind them, especially after the 2002 and 2003 incident with Trent Lott, which was a terrible embarrassment to the party that ultimately led to a shakeup in the party leadership. I think that the party had hoped that all this was behind them, that Jesse Helms was gone, Strom Thurmond was gone, Trent Lott was gone. But now we have Jeff Sessions, who, as you just noted, is just as bad as them, if not even worse in some instances. And now he's going to be the face of the party on the Judiciary Committee. It raises all kinds of political problems for the party. And this is a party that at least can afford more problems like this right now.
Steve, it seems to me that if this had happened through some sort of accident of seniority, it would be sort of another bad day for the Republicans. It would be something that was sort of bad luck in terms of the arcane rules of the Senate. But because of the specific circumstances around Arlen Specter switching parties and the way that this position of seniority became available, what's remarkable to me here is that conservative bloggers pushed for Jeff Sessions to have this spot. What is it about him that appeals to the right wing of the Republican Party and the conservative movement?
Well, when you look at the members of the Republican leaders on this committee, he is by far the most right-wing for all the reasons we just talked about. I think that we saw a number of right-wing bloggers and talk radio and others pushing for him to take this leadership role precisely because of his ideology, again reinforcing the problems with the party. You know, they're in the midst of this rebranding effort, trying to decide whether the far right wing really dictates the direction of the party. And ultimately, with this, in this case, we see that they do, because here he is taking this leadership role at least for the next year and a half.
And that in a year and a half, they'll be switcherooing again at this point. But we know for a fact that he will be the ranking Republican during the consideration of the Supreme Court nominee. Steve, Senator Sessions, told reporters today that senators shouldn't filibuster judicial nominees unless there were extraordinary circumstances. But then he said if there are problems, they should be aired. What do we know about his record on the handling of Supreme Court nominees? Obviously, as a rejected judicial nominee himself, he's got sort of a complicated record here.
He does, but I think to a certain extent during the Bush years, he was quite consistent. He suggested that any filibustering of any judicial nominee, especially Supreme Court nominees, not only was wrong, not only was offensive to him, but tore at the very fabric of democracy. The worst possible thing a senator could do would be filibustering a judicial nominee. And so if he wanted to try and change direction now and suggest that Obama nominees might be subject to the same kind of scrutiny, then he'd have to kind of engage in some kind of rhetorical acrobatics that I don't think he can really pull off. So he's in a difficult position right now, and I think that he's going to have to kind of walk that line very carefully.
I don't know. It seems to me very clear that Democratic filibusters tear at the fabric of democracy, and Republican filibusters, you know, make everybody happy. Obviously, that's the way that goes. In terms of him having this leadership role on the Judiciary Committee for the next year and a half, presumably Sessions will make that committee run very differently than having the senior Republican on that committee be Arlen Specter, right?
I think that's fair to say. You know, obviously Specter was probably one of the most moderate members of the Senate, certainly the most moderate Republican on that committee. Jeff Sessions, for all the reasons we've just talked about, is much far to the right, and he'll be the public face. You know, you talked earlier in the show about the rebranding effort. It undermines the rebranding when you have someone with these deep and ugly racial problems from dating back a couple of decades, and now he'll be the public face of the Judiciary Committee, not only on judicial nominations, but also on issues like civil rights laws that automatically go to the Judiciary Committee. So this is a problem for the party, it's a problem for the committee, and I'm anxious to see how it turns out for them.
I'm anxious to hear him explain yet again how the disgrace to his race comment was a joke. That'll be great. Washington Monthly's Steve Bennin. Thank you so much, Steve. It's nice to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.